Let's start with a brief summary. This article, written by Paul Graham in 2007, presents an alternative theory on the emergence of high paying union jobs and how they have changed over time. Graham sees the emergence of these jobs as a result of a rapidly growing market where reliable supply was more important than low cost. However, he notes that today's rapidly growing companies are investing in different things, and unions are losing their effectiveness in this process. Graham argues that the reason for this change is not a lack of high moral courage in people, but the nature of the market. Before we dive in, I want to share a quick note about how this podcast is created. As you've probably noticed, this podcast isn't voiced by a human, but by artificial intelligence. I'm obligated to inform you of this beforehand due to the rules of AI services. This podcast is made possible by our sponsor, Wope.com, an AI startup that combines content marketing with artificial intelligence to significantly boost traffic and revenue of your startups. For all the latest content, be sure to follow me at x.com, Yigit Koner. Now, let's turn our attention back to the essay, Exploring an Alternative Theory to the Existence of Labor Unions. Original title, An Alternative Theory of Unions. Date, May 2007. People who worry about the increasing gap between rich and poor generally look back on the mid-20th century as a golden age. In those days, we had a large number of high-paying union manufacturing jobs that boosted the median income. I wouldn't quite call the high-paying union job a myth, but I think people who dwell on it are reading too much into it. Oddly enough, it was working with startups that made me realize where the high-paying union job came from. In a rapidly growing market, you don't worry too much about efficiency. It's more important to grow fast. If there's some mundane problem getting in your way, and there's a simple solution that's somewhat expensive, just take it and get on with more important things. eBay didn't win by paying less for servers than their competitors. Difficult though it may be to imagine now, manufacturing was a growth industry in the mid-20th century. This was an era when small firms making everything from cars to candy were getting consolidated into a new kind of corporation with national reach and huge economies of scale. You had to grow fast or die. Workers were for these companies what servers are for an internet startup. A reliable supply was more important than low cost. If you looked in the head of a 1950s auto executive, the attitude must have been, sure, give them whatever they ask for, so long as the new model isn't delayed. In other words, those workers were not paid what their work was worth. Circumstances being what they were, companies would have been stupid to insist on paying them so little. If you want a less controversial example of this phenomenon, ask anyone who worked as a consultant building websites during the internet bubble. In the late 90s, you could get paid huge sums of money for building the most trivial things. And yet, does anyone who was there have any expectation those days will ever return? I doubt it. Surely everyone realizes that was just a temporary aberration. The era of labor unions seems to have been the same kind of aberration, just spread over a longer period, and mixed together with a lot of ideology that prevents people from viewing it with as cold an eye as they would something like consulting during the bubble. Basically, unions were just razorfish. People who think the labor movement was the creation of heroic union organizers have a problem to explain. Why are unions shrinking now? The best they can do is fall back on the default explanation of people living in fallen civilizations. Our ancestors were giants. The workers of the early 20th century must have had a moral courage that's lacking today. In fact, there's a simpler explanation. The early 20th century was just a fast-growing startup, overpaying for infrastructure. And we in the present are not a fallen people who have abandoned whatever mysterious high-minded principles produced the high-paying union job. We simply live in a time when the fast-growing companies overspend on different things.